Hey everybody, it's going to be a quick video. We're going to talk about placing and moving assets within the scene. This is very basic stuff, but absolutely critical if you want to make any kind of scene in 3D in Unreal Engine. So to start, I'm going to do a blank project. I am going to call it Placing and Moving Objects. Great. Oh, can't be longer than 20 characters. So let's just call it Placing and Moving. No starter content. We'll keep it very small. Ignore that error message. It's Steam VR. And create project. All right, so once that's done, you'll be in the default view here in the blank project. We have a floor, player start, some fog, a skybox, a light source. All right, so it's pretty basic. I'm going to zoom out. Again, I'm holding the right mouse button and just pressing S. Just makes it a little easier to move around here. Right, so we're going to place and move objects, and the easiest, quickest way to do that is if we take a look at the Modes tab here, you'll notice we've got quite a few objects, and if you mouse over each one, it'll kind of tell you what it is. And if you want to get any details, you can click this this question mark icon, and that'll open a web browser and give you some really detailed documentation in terms of what this particular object happens to be. We'll go through the Modes tab in more detail when we talk about things like actors and blueprints and white boxing. We'll generally get through most of these, with the exception of something like all classes, which is just a very long list of stuff here. All right, so let's keep on the basics sub-tab, and let's choose a cube. So to place an object in this particular way, we can just click it and drag it, and you'll notice it just drags a cube and it tries to snap it to the midpoint. So pretty much right in the middle of the floor here. Now let's say we want to move this cube, and we want to move it up along the z-axis. So looking down here in the lower left of the viewport, you'll see we have the coordinate system here, and as we move our mouse around, you'll see the y and the x changing. If we do that, if we were to be able to roll, you would see the z changing. So this is helpful. The colors, by the way, correspond. The red, blue, and green, you can see correspond here in the axis directions as well, to red, blue, and green. So Z is the up direction. So let's say we want to move this cube so that it is no longer sitting in the middle of our floor. Well, one way to do that is just to mouse over the gizmo here and pull it up. So left click, pull that up. You notice it will snap actually as you move it. So that's one way to move. By the same token, again, I'm using the first person control, so I'm holding down the right mouse button as I move around. I can move it along the y-axis by just grabbing the green arrow, and the x-axis by grabbing the red arrow. Additionally, what you can do is if you mouse over kind of the middle point between two directions, they'll both highlight, and this is going to allow you to move along a plane. So if I click this, and left clicking, I can actually move it along the plane, which in this case is the x and y plane. Sorry, the x and y plane here. By the same token, I can do the z and x plane by grabbing here and have it move like that, and the z and y plane, having it do that. And if I get right in the middle of it, I can move it kind of randomly wherever my mouse happens to be. Right. So let's say we've done this and it's a mess and we have no idea where things are. Maybe there's another cube in this scene. It's very hard for me to even tell. They kind of look like they're aligned. Maybe, oh, they're aligned. No, they're not. They're totally not aligned, and it's kind of a mess. Well, one thing that we can do quickly, let's say we don't necessarily care about the position of these. We want to get them back to some kind of normal position. We can use the transform tab within the details panel. So if you look over here on the right hand side, you'll see that there's when you select one of these objects, this happens to be a static mesh cube, you'll see a number of properties within the details tab here. And the first property, probably most important when you're starting, is the transform property. And this tells you its location, its rotation, and its scale. It also tells you its mobility. And its mobility, if you mouse over, it'll tell you kind of what is selected. So this is a static object. It can't be changed in the game. So it's very fast when rendering, and this matters a lot in VR. This is if it was a stationary object, it can be changed in the game, but not moved. So this would allow it to cast dynamic shadows. And if it's a movable object, it can be changed in the game. It's totally dynamic, and it does cast a movable shadow. But it's slower to render, so pay attention. Don't just check everything and make it movable. I normally keep static game objects, meaning things that aren't going to move. Keep them as static, which will be the default when placing them. So anyway, back to the transform component, we have location, rotation, and scale. And on the location, you notice this little red and green and blue little tab here, indicators. Those correspond to X, Y, and Z in world space, in the coordinate space here. We also get this little back arrow. This is reset to default. If we click that, it's going to go back to 0, 0, 0, which is the world origin, the 0 point within your level, within the scene as you have. And I could do the same thing with this one. They would just be overlapping each other. So I'm going to delete this other cube. And I can do that in a number of ways. I can click the delete key. I can highlight cube 2 here in the world outliner, right click, edit, delete. That's the really long way, so I wouldn't recommend that. And we're back to square one. I'm going to hit F to focus on it, and let's move it back up, kind of sitting on the floor. Right, so just to recap, there's one way to move things, which is just using the gizmo within the viewport. That's fine. Another way to move things is through the transform component. So I could just say, click here in X and make that 0. I can make Y 0, and I can keep Z at 80, because I happen to know 80 is the Z position of the top of this floor. So that's kind of sitting on that. Now, by the same token, I can do things like rotate and scale. So how do we do that? Well, there's a number of ways to do it. There's a hotkey, which I use a lot, and that happens to be, when this is selected, if you press the E key, you'll go to rotate mode, the R key is scale, and the W mode is movement. You can also use these buttons here on the upper right of the viewport. If we mouse over them, the first one is the translation tool. That corresponds to W. The next is the rotation tool. That corresponds to E. And the final one is the scale tool. That corresponds to R. Another hotkey that I've found myself using quite a bit and is just the spacebar. So if you have something selected and you press the spacebar, it will cycle between all of them. So if I'm moving something and I say, well, I want to rotate it, I'll press spacebar. And then by the same token, if I highlight over one of these directions, it will, if I move over one of these directions, it will highlight. And then I can click my left mouse button and I can rotate, in this case, 90 degrees. In addition, I can rotate along the y-axis 90 degrees, and I can rotate along the x-axis 90 degrees. Now you might notice as I do this, it's only letting me move in 10-degree increments. And so that's kind of the next piece in terms of movement and placement that I wanted to show you, and it has to do with snapping. So we'll skip over this other button that says Transform Gizmo Coordinate System. That's very helpful when you want to go between a relative coordinate system and a world coordinate system, and what that means is world coordinate system, all objects would share that same coordinate system. meaning they share the world's coordinate system. So in this case, I've just dragged a cube in and I've rotated it. But you notice my gizmo, X still points up, and the Y is still pointing to the left in this view. That's because I'm in my world coordinate system, and no matter what I select, you'll notice that the transform here, this gizmo, we'll just call it a gizmo, is always pointing up. On the other hand, if I want to cycle to relative, that actually changes the coordinate system relative to the object that's selected. So we saw it immediately here. All of a sudden, X becomes X relative to the cube, and I can do things like this. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you have your coordinate system kind of messed up when you're selecting things, you notice this now all of a sudden is pointed in the other direction, and that's because I rotated it. If I rotate it again, you'll notice it starts to change there. So that has its uses, especially when you're placing objects relative to one another and you don't want to do a bunch of operations. You can change your coordinate system. Right, so we ended up going over that anyway, which is good, but back to the rotation. Like I said, you notice you're rotating in 10-degree increments as you move your mouse. And what I'm doing is I'm holding left on the mouse button, and I'm just kind of pushing my mouse to the right and to the left. Up and down would do the same thing. Right, so skipping over the editor surface snap options, you notice that this next one says enable or disable snapping to the grid when dragging objects around. So if we unselected that, it does nothing. It's because we're not dragging an object around. We're actually rotating one. Right? And so this will do nothing either, setting the position grid snap value. This happens to do with moving objects. Right? So if we went into the movement options here, and we disable that snapping to grid, then it's just going to slide right along here, and it's no longer going to snap. In fact, it makes it very difficult to place things when you're trying to snap things together, but if you want something that's very, very precise, you can temporarily disable the snapping to the grid. Let's go back to kind of a good place there. Okay, so we'll keep that on. Next, we have the position grid snap value. So many times you can keep the snap on, and you can just set your snap size to something like 1. And when it says grid, I'll show you the grid. And really the grid is just this orthographic grid that we saw in the viewport. So this is the grid snapping. So if we zoomed all the way in here, we would see snapping to one of those grid units. And let's put this back to, let's put our location and rotation back. We'll hit the F key and we're back here. So by default the snap is going to be 10, and you see it's just snapping along that grid. I would recommend when you're starting out, try to keep everything snapped to the grid, because when we get into the white boxing tutorial, it's important because we're not going to be using these meshes. We're going to use something called a BSP brush, which allows us to do a lot more and a lot faster iteration in terms of our 3D design and our level design, but the BSP brushes do not enjoy being unsnapped to a grid. When I say don't enjoy, there's a lot of times where you'll get very weird errors and things won't necessarily work the way that you want them to. So try to keep snap to grid on. Okay, so again, I'm back to where I started, all trying to get you to this point to talk about the rotation. Okay, so here's rotation. You can also disable or enable snapping objects to a rotation grid. And this is the rotation grid here. You get a little view of it. Kind of, you can see it very, very faintly. And if I turn that off, now all of a sudden, I'm free to rotate. I'm free to turn in any way that I want in any amount of degrees, up to about 2 decimal places. So I rarely do that. I normally always keep my rotation grid set, and you can change the both the common degrees snap value and also the divisions of a circle. So if I made this 5 degrees, you can now see it snapping between 0, 5, 10, 15, etc. So this depends on what you're placing. You may just want to temporarily turn either one of these off, depending on the style or the aesthetic you're going for. Now, lastly, is the scale tool. And this scale tool works in the way you'd expect. It scales. So if you mouse over the X gizmo, and you hold the left mouse button and you go left and right, it's going to scale, and it's going to scale along this point here, which happens to be in the center of the object. Right? And look at our transform component, you see those same values are being changed. So as I scale, I'm scaling up by 0.25, which happens to also be my scaling option here. If I made this 0.125 and I start scaling, you'll notice that I'm highlighting this X value here. It will change by 0.125. So let's go back to 1. When I'm scaling, I will generally do, depends on what I'm trying to go for, but if I want to make something uniformly big, I can either mouse over the middle of this, where it will highlight all 3 components, transform components of the gizmo, and I'll move my mouse left or right while holding the left mouse button. That will make it large or small. By the same token, you can scale on a plane. So this happens to be the Y and X plane here. Let me go back into my world coordinate system. I should be able to do that. Let's see. For some reason I can't. Let's try it. There we go. Oh, yes, that's another point. So scale is always going to be in the relative coordinate system. So don't worry too much about that. I guess it would be kind of strange to have it in the world coordinate system. Right? See? As I scale, it's going to go back to that. Probably not a lot of demand for that feature. All right, so you can scale along a plane. That's a lesser used thing. The other thing you can do, back to the transform component, and by the way, you can transform directly, or you can rotate and change location and scale directly from the transform component if that's something you want to do. With scale, you can lock X, Y, and Z values so they're all the same. They maintain that relative ratio with each other. And what that means is right now I have, well, let's just put this back to 1, so it's now our default cube, and lock this. If I change this to 3, everything's 3. So I don't have to go through and change 3, 3, 3. So, right. Or if I think that's great, it's 3, 3, 3, 1, and I lock that, and I make that 5, it will then scale that by the same amount. Right, so this gets times 5, and the same one is times 5. Right. So that'll come by default unlocked. All right, so that's placing and moving objects. Just one other quick note. Just remember, if you want to get back to default, you can just click the back buttons there. One other note, when placing objects, it can be quite helpful to use the grids, to use the orthographic views. And that's because of something I showed you earlier where I just dragged an object into a scene, and it's very difficult for us in that 3D view to really understand exactly where something is placed. So aligning it to the top, let's say I want this cube directly on the corner of the floor. Well, okay, I did it from the top, but I should definitely go left, and now if we zoom in, we know it needs to be raised up. So there's the floor, there's the cube. At this point, if I go into my perspective mode, I know it's all good, right? So there it happens to be. Great. So that's about placing and moving objects. We placed in one way by dragging something out here. Another way to do that would be from the content folder directly. So we didn't start with any starter content, although there happens to be some in hiding within any project. If you go to the view options and you say show engine content, that's going to give you some folders here. C++ classes, please ignore those, and then engine content. So you get an engine content folder. That's the stuff that comes along for the ride with any project you do. It includes things like this cube. It includes things like this sphere, etc. And there's a lot of stuff in here. But let's say I'm very interested in finding something that's like a cube. I can actually select engine content, and then there's ability to search here. So if I type the word cube, I'm going to see all things that have the word cube in them highlighted. And this actually looks like, here's a cube. It's a texture because it's got this red underline. So I know that's not what I want. I want something with a blue underline, which is a mesh. And so there's something called a background cube. I don't know what that is. In fact, I don't care. because all I want to show you how to do is how to place an object in the scene that you have within your content browser. So if I click this, left click it, and drag it, it's going to drag here. It might take a second to render the texture. It looks like this is some kind of a, oh cool, this is like a carved out cube. I like this. It's already like a room. It has no material assigned to it, but that's okay. Still looks kind of cool. Just ignore what I did there. I didn't even know what that was. And I tried to make a material out of it. Yeah, so don't follow that piece. We'll delete that if we can. Okay, great. All right, so that should cover the basics of movement and placement. So go ahead and I'd recommend start a new project, add starter content if you want. Start placing stuff, scaling things, try to build a little room, get familiar with moving things around, scaling them, snapping them together, making them look and feel pretty normal and nice. Great.